Hello, everyone, and welcome to my podcast, Scott Parker Goes Live. For those who don't know me, I've been called a covert human rights campaigner. Others, I expect, describe me more as a social entrepreneur and thought leader who invented the first business-owned disability network and has a long career persuading senior executives that treating people properly, including people with disabilities, is good for business, and then showing them how. Some argue that I have supped with the private sector devil so long, with that famous long spoon, that I have in fact gone over to the dark side. Whatever you call me, after some 30 years hacking away at this, I'm still asking the questions that I think really matter. Why is it so hard to get "and what about disability" into the ethical and responsible AI debate? Why do so many of the diversity managers who describe diversity as a choice choose not to tackle disability discrimination? And since when is treating people fairly and with respect defined as a choice? Well, I guess you could argue not robbing a bank is a choice. Why do we have health conditions and it's other people who have disabilities? And why do we just take it for granted that HR practitioners don't have a clue about the impact of disability discrimination on, well, their human resources? I don't know about you, but I expect a doctor to know the difference between your elbow and your knee. And with all that said, let's dive into this episode.
Good morning, Susan. It's so wonderful to be able to interview you for your very own podcast this morning. We're not going to get into huge introductions, as that's been covered in the intro, but I do have a question. In your introduction, you talk about being covert. How, in your experience, do you change the way that people see the world?
Well, that expression, "you're a covert human rights campaigner," was a comment from a senior HR director at British Telecom some time ago. And it's because I was celebrating the fact that a group of companies, in partnership with the disability rights movement and the trade unions in the UK, had come together to push for more stringent, more rigorous, more credible disability discrimination legislation. That was in the early 90s when the Disability Discrimination Act came in. And so as I was standing in this hallway with him, I was saying, "We did it. It's coming through. It's fantastic." And he said, "Susan, your pink slip is showing." Meaning, of course, that this left-winger covert campaigner had come in and pretended to actually, not talk about rights, because I was talking about best practice and how business can improve its business performance so that people with disabilities also benefit. But of course, the principles we were working to and how we do, in terms of how we define best practice for a company, just happen to be the basic principles that you would expect if you were looking at the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So I was vastly amused, but it took me about another 20 years before I ever said the phrase covert human rights campaigner out loud again.
So do you agree that politically correct language is essential? The first demand, as it were, when we are dealing with these kinds of issues?
Not really. I think the first starting point here is respect, having respect for each other. So business having respectful conversations with people with disabilities, coming to an understanding of their reality and recognizing that actually you can't make assumptions about human beings and their lives. You need to have those conversations. And in the respectful conversations, you start to get an insight into what the language that does seem to offend. I mean, I can remember in those early days, the word cripple was no longer really acceptable. A lot of people didn't use it in business or anywhere else, but the Pope did. So the Pope would still meet with cripples, and when the occasion arose in the Vatican. But over time, the conversations with people with disabilities made it clear that there were certain terms that were deeply hurtful, and that actually hindered their life chances. We had invalid toilets, remember?
Yeah.
Which is actually saying not valid. So these toilets are for people who are not valid. So once you start thinking about that, you can start a new conversation.
Mm.
But I think the most important thing for me is an aggressive insistence on politically correct language as the start point. Frightens people away who are terrified that they might just say it wrong, get it wrong by accident. And I can remember the then Prime Minister of the UK, for the first time, stood up in public and talked about disability, but he said the disabled instead of people with disabilities. And he was attacked by the disability rights movement for it. And he never talked about disability in public again, right? And so technically they were right. He shouldn't have said the disabled, but if you're trying to change the way that Prime Minister looks at the world, then you say, well, thank you very much for starting the conversation. And as you get to know us, you'll get an insight into why we are not very keen on this the disabled, as though it's some kind of a big chunk of human beings. All the same, you can just talk about them in the general when we're trying to talk about individual human beings and their needs and aspirations. But if you attack as the first conversation point, you don't get a second conversation.
Absolutely. I think so many people are so fearful that they don't even start conversations. And I think it's not only in the disability space, I think in a much wider context, people have that fear of saying the wrong thing so the conversation doesn't come up.
Indeed.
So,
and I mean, we're seeing now real attacks on free speech in a way which makes it difficult to talk about all kinds of things in an honest, evidence-based, sensible manner. So I'm agreeing with you.
absolutely. So we understand that change is required, but what are the most effective models for change? When and why do people actually change behavior?
Well, that's a question and a half, isn't it? There's 2 or 3 levels of this for me. One is understanding that we're asking human beings as individuals to change. And we're asking organizations to change. And we're asking societies to change. So there is no single change model. You can't just quickly say, well, if I give them some data, they'll change. We know data doesn't change behavior. You can walk around talking about the 1.3, 1.5 billion people with disabilities all day. What are they going to do differently? Who's going to do what differently just because they get some data? And of course, the data problem is if you don't have data, they argue, well, we can't do anything because we haven't got data. So we developed a kind of way of looking at what we needed to do, and by we, I mean the Business Disability Network that I set up in the UK, which is now BDF UK. And so there were 2 or 3 processes here. One was we had to help an individual business leader move from engage, equip to deliver. You couldn't just jump into suddenly doing something that had never been done before as far as his company was concerned and getting it right. So engage is that bit that says, maybe this really is interesting. I thought this was just going to be too hard and irrelevant, and this is worth pursuing. Equip is beginning to learn how. What do we have to do? And deliver, of course, is making it happen. And often inside a company, deliver means starting to reach out to experts and advisors in the outside world. But then we realized that actually there was something underlying all that. And that was we only saw change when people in business were talking, and I'm saying people in business, not business, when people in business started to learn directly from people with disabilities. It was only that face-to-face encounter, the informally, we used to have parties with a purpose. We'd find a purpose in summer. We'd have a summer party and we'd give it some kind of a topic, leadership. Everybody wants to talk about leadership. 4-minute speech list, nobody could talk more than 4 minutes, but we would have 100 people with disabilities, 100 people from business together, pour in lots of wine and orange juice and just let it happen. And I can still remember a very senior fellow from a huge pharmaceutical coming up to me after one of our events. It was at the House of Lords in the UK. And he said, Susan, I met this really interesting man, James Partridge, and he's looking at people with facial disfigurement. I'd never thought about that before. And we were chatting over a glass of wine about his new campaign. And that's a completely different encounter in terms of enabling that individual business leader to start to relax. He's having an interesting conversation with an interesting man who has a facial disfigurement and is at the House of Lords and is doing an interesting UK-wide and then global campaign. So those face-to-face encounters, building the personal disability confidence of the individual, absolutely crucial. But they're also, of course, part of the next stage, which is helping that individual business leader develop professional expertise. So he has to be personally confident and then professionally confident. And I can still remember a very senior police officer who'd had to arrest a disabled person. I think he was a wheelchair user. And he actually said to me, the officer, "I've never felt so unprofessionalized in my life. I don't know how to arrest a wheelchair user. I can't get him into the vehicle." And so that captured his interest, and he had to learn how. And of course, one of the questions for them was, should he take the wheelchair away from the individual when he goes into the cell? Because he'd had a wheelchair using offender once who threw the wheelchair as a weapon at him. So there are these nuances of how it connects to the experience of the individual that we're trying to influence. But I guess the main point here about this learning directly is it has proven to be such a powerful way of helping people in business to get over the assumption that this is going to be too hard, too bleak. It's about people who obviously aren't in my world, and they start to see it's actually about people I know. That took us, of course, to the Disabled Employee Network, the ERGs. These are people who work for me. I had no idea. And the magic work that Purple Space have been doing here, helping ERG leaders, employee resource group leaders focused on employees with disabilities, to develop their personal confidence so that they can negotiate on the expectation they're going to get the adjustments they need so they can develop their careers, but also to help senior executives in the company to understand what would make it easier for every employee to contribute. If the company was just clever and a little more disability confident and didn't make assumptions about what people can do just because they've got some kind of a disability label. So it's the personal, those are two chunks of personal capacity building, really. Personal confidence, social confidence, if you like, and then professional. And then you start to look at what does the company have to do so that it actually delivers best practice across the business. And that's where having those business leaders outside the HR practitioner group is so important. Because of course, a disability confident business has to influence the way technology operates. It has to be accessible for everybody. Influence procurement. They have to stop buying inaccessible technology. Influence facilities management, who have to respond quickly when the built environment has to be adapted. You know, the light bulb that gives me migraines, change the light bulb, and you don't need 18 months to change my light bulb. So that's the progression. And then it's what we discovered was the power of business disability networking, because a group of companies joint funding a small expert team that helps them as individuals in business to develop the confidence, the skills, and then to change the way their organizations manage people and respond to customers. Because don't forget, we've also spent a lot of time looking at how you welcome customers with disabilities, which is a hugely important driver for change.
Susan, which brings me beautifully to my next question. How important is it to understand resistors when advocating for change? What are the pitfalls here?
Well, it's essential. If you don't understand what's getting in the way, how on earth can you get around it, over it, get rid of it? We're in a world where we don't want to talk about the problems. We want to talk about opportunities and solutions, but you can't have solutions to problems you haven't diagnosed. So when I talk about that human confidence growth, if you like, moving from not really being comfortable having lunch with someone who's blind or someone who has no arms, how do you get over that social resistance, if you like? I just don't want to feel uncomfortable. I want to avoid those encounters. I think there's two levels of resistors. Well, there's more than two. We need to understand in effect, that we need to make it easier for people to change than not to change. And that if you are working in a world where you're trying to influence the behavior of your local business community, you want them to change their behavior, you need to understand that sometimes, or that often, the reason the obstacles you encounter are not malicious. People don't often wake up in the morning thinking, I wonder how many disabled people I can treat badly today. Yeah. If you accept the fact that often it's inadvertent, it's deep-rooted assumptions, it's things that they just never thought about. And if you've never actually seen someone who's blind working on the internet as a researcher, I mean, I can remember an HR director in Hong Kong just saying to me, well, blind people can't use the internet, obviously. Now, you can call that bias, but she's never seen a blind person use the internet. She's no idea what the technology now makes possible. And so once she meets a blind researcher, that changes. She's never met a blind researcher. However, I'm off the plot here a bit. What we've discovered is you need to make it easier for the well-intentioned business leader to drive change. Because if the well-intentioned business person continues to really struggle to get the information they need, they can't get the support for their managers, they don't know what to do to fix their technology, they don't know where to go to get the building, fixed up. If you can't make it easier for the well-intentioned employer, the rest can just sit where they are. Nothing's going to shift. And so you have to look at things like, how difficult is it for this individual to justify changing their behavior to their boss or their colleagues? And so an example would be, you'll find a business leader who's a champion on disability in company X. He changes and goes to company Y, a new job, and I ring him up and he says, well, Susan, I'm going to have to be here at least 6 months before I can say disability out loud. Now, I think that's really interesting. And that's because he doesn't yet have the credibility, as far as he's concerned, with his peers and the board, to start talking about an issue that he suspects is going to be regarded as quite marginal and a little weird. Why are you talking about disability? You're head of marketing, right? You're head of procurement. And so we need to understand that the individual is personally at risk if they go too far outside what his organization or her organization expects. So you have to minimize the risks. And one of the ways you minimize the risks is you give him a list of all the competitors for that bank that are actively addressing the needs of customers with disabilities. So he can sit in meetings with his counterparts and say, well, Barclays is doing that, NatWest is doing that. Why aren't we doing that? You need to give them the information and the confidence. And I suppose the other thing really about the resistors is it starts with what I said at the beginning, thinking of influencing a business as influencing people in business. I know that sounds really simplistic and kind of silly, but these are individual human beings. And that once you connect with them as human beings, they start to say things like, well, Susan, I've got a grandson with dyslexia. They start to think, oh, this actually affects my world in a personal way. And then they can draw the connection that says, and the way I can make it easier for my grandson to have a thriving career in the future is by helping my own organization learn how to adapt for colleagues with dyslexia. There's connections there. I can keep going. I just don't quite know when to stop on that one.
And I also think you make such an important point that if you are connecting with that human being, there's such a huge population that is affected and living with disabilities that we all know somebody, and making it personal and real to that business leader. It's not just a number on paper.
And doing it in a way which is not antagonistic. I think the biggest resistor we've got out there, if you look at job markets in almost any country, is the deep-rooted assumption on the part of the disability sector. The organizations either run by disabled people, organizations of people with disabilities, OPDs, or NGOs or international nonprofits that are funded to help people get work and find it's really hard And of course, one of the reasons it's really hard is that they blame the business community as the problem.
Mm.
And so if you treat people like a problem, what usually happens?
Yeah.
They don't want to turn up for the next conference. They don't want to.
Absolutely.
Why would they engage on this? And so the big message here is one of the big obstacles we've got is this gap between people in the disability sector doing their best to help disabled people get a job and the only people in the world who can give them the job, the business community. And so the big story here is anything that the disability community can do that makes it easier for the well-intentioned employer to find the right candidates with the right skills at the right time and knowing they've got support for their managers. Anything that makes it easier for that employer is going to make it easier for people with disabilities wanting to work in the private sector. And there are a lot of people out there who want to work in the private sector, even though many of the people helping them to find work have never worked in the private sector. And so they don't really understand that reality. And so they can't advise the individual on how to negotiate their way into a reality they've never personally experienced. So we've got to bring that together. And I think the more we can bring the people in business together directly with people with disabilities, rather than with the intermediaries, that's where we're going to see the real change. And that's where it gets easier for everybody.
And I suppose also much more exciting for everybody, being able to see that talent pipeline, being able to have the discussion about what does the business really need and getting those people into those positions, and not assuming what business needs.
Well, and understanding that your job, if you want to help people into work, is to meet the needs of business. Because if you make it too hard for business, everybody loses. I was talking to an employer recently in the Middle East, and they were keen to recruit people with disabilities. They were interested. One of the nonprofits sent them 100 CVs of people with disabilities, but they didn't tell the individuals they were sending their CVs. And so the company is having to phone 100 people to say, do you want to work for this company? I mean, what is that? That means it sets the individuals up for yet more discouragement because they don't really want to work for that company. They didn't know their CV was being put forward, or they do want to work for them, but the CV was just sort of dropped on the company. The individual hasn't had a chance to actually demonstrate as an individual what they could do. That's the kind of systemic obstacle we're looking at when it comes to making it easier for the employers to say yes.
So, I want you just to elaborate on the interaction between the socio-technical elements, such as the human factors and technology, in the context of organizational change. Nothing exists in a vacuum, and I think there is a massive interplay between those specific elements.
Absolutely. I think the example I'd use is the fast emerging threat, if you like, to the life chances of disabled people, posed by the way people in the HR arena are deploying technology developed by people in the AI technology arena. And neither groups of those people understand disability discrimination. And so we need to train the human beings who deploy the technology in a different way. Any HR director who purchases technology which promises to remove human bias doesn't understand that the technology was not developed by aliens. But they also don't understand that when that tech developer promises to have removed bias because they have a standardized process that everyone has to go through and it's exactly the same, they don't realize that that is called discrimination. Because if you have the next Stephen Hawking standing at the, sitting at the bottom of the stairs waiting to go up to the standardized interview on the first floor, people now would go, well, that's not right. They should move the interview room. But when it's in artificial intelligence, when it's automated e-recruitment processes, they don't move that interview to the first floor. So we've got the human interaction, if you like, in that they don't understand discrimination. And you've got the technical problems caused by how difficult it is to get rid of disability bias when the data is drawn from people in work, and people with disabilities are hard to find in work.
Yeah.
And many, and what is the stat? They're 2 or 3 times less likely to be in work. So the data doesn't actually help an employer make sure that they are accurately predicting the performance of this young man who stammers, but who's only got 3 minutes to get through that video interview, or he's thrown out because he took a few seconds longer. So yes, it's always the human and the technical coming together. And of course, you've got procurement in the midst there who do not ask the right questions when they go out to market. So they're not asking their developers when they're buying HR tech, where's the evidence this does not discriminate against visually impaired job seekers? And they would argue in human terms, well, it's an HR issue. We just buying what we're told to buy. And when I say, well, if HR said, I want to buy some machine guns, you'd probably go to HR and say, help me understand why you're buying these machine guns. Yeah, you'd kind of probe a little bit. Have you looked at the risks? And that's the kind of interaction that we're talking about.
Susan, what, in your opinion, are some of the deeply held assumptions that hinder progress? And how can these effectively be challenged?
Well, I mean, there's so many bits of research around the world over the years about the assumptions. I suppose one is that all disabilities are visible. People kind of think we're talking about people in electric wheelchairs with, parrots on their shoulders and support dogs and speech impairments and blind and deaf, and they're all in one person, right? They immediately default to the most extreme image they have. And they don't realize 80% of people with disabilities, it's non-visible. They don't realize it's about the experience of being a human being. If you live to be 70, you're likely to have 10 years personal experience of disability. I think it's a combination of fear. A blind friend of mine says he's been told so many times, I'd kill myself if I went blind. And he's thinking, so I'm disappointing you? I should have just shot myself. On the other hand, there's that denial. Well, it could never happen to me. So this has got nothing to do with me. And it's well, my brother isn't disabled. He just doesn't like stairs. Right. And then with age, and of course, you've got the 1 in 3 people aged 50 to 64 will have a disability. Well, with age, I'm not disabled. I've just got bad hips. I've just got arthritis.
Yeah.
I just can't open anything you give me anymore. And I certainly don't like small print, but I'm not disabled. I'm 75. Yeah. So there's all kinds of nonsense that gets in the way of that. I think the issue for me is the messaging being for the employer, because that's our focus, I know. We have to give everyone the tools and flexibility they need in order to do really well here. And that includes the 20% of the workforce minimum that has a disability or health condition, which means that if we were disability clever and went in and gave them a solution, a tool, a bit of kit, a bit of flexibility, they could do their job 10 times better. So we've got to make that shift. But at the moment, we're still struggling with the assumption that actually, when I say the word disability, I'm talking about doctors, sickness and stuff. And that you've got the well-intentioned manager who's not disability confident, as we would call it. This well-intentioned manager looks at you when you're diagnosed with MS, multiple sclerosis, and says, oh, you poor thing. Oh, I'm so sorry. Why don't you go home and get better? Whereas the disability, bright manager goes, oh, that's really a pity. What could we do at work so that you can continue to do your job while the doctors do their thing? And they don't send you to a doctor to prove you've got MS. What have doctors got to do with the management decision that says, tell me what impact it's having on you at work? You're having trouble concentrating. You need some flexible working time. Your eyesight's beginning to get a little bit affected. Let's take a look at the technology to make sure that you've got what you need on screen to make it easy for you to read your irritating emails.
Yep.
So it's a mind shift there, but we're still a bit stuck in this assumption that the disability word equals doctors. However, if we avoid the disability word, as we see this frantic quest to, in terms of euphemisms, handicapable, disabled, DIF, right? Differently abled. Unfortunately, that also risks the management forgetting that actually they have in most jurisdictions a legal, certainly an ethical obligation to make the reasonable adjustments for people with disabilities that enable them to contribute on an equal basis. So the word disability, you know, we've got to be careful with it. We've got to start to move towards much more of what we're seeing with so many young people with disabilities now, disability pride. You know, why should I be ashamed of this word if it's part of my life and part of the identity I decide to take for myself? It's not, there's no easy answer to any of this, except where I started, which is respectful conversations between people with disabilities and or if they want individuals who call themselves disabled people, because that's what they prefer. So the message to businesses, talk to people, ask them what they prefer. How hard is that?
Yeah. And Susan, you know, just coming back to, surely if you have an employee and you're paying them a salary and you want them to be as productive as possible and contribute to business success, surely you give them the tools to enable them to do just that. You know, it boggles the mind. Just coming back to the engagement between business and the nonprofits, how do we avoid blaming the target audience for the failure of inadequate messages and interventions? What strategies can help crafting more effective messages to our intended target audience?
Well, I think it starts with understanding, if you're in the disability sector or the governments that fund you or the foundations that fund you, right? There's a huge investment in the economic empowerment of people with disabilities. The international development community, organizations like GIZ, the German development organization, working so hard to bring people with disabilities into the mainstream economic development arena. It's understanding that one of the reasons you and I are even having this conversation is the old messaging hasn't worked, right? Just that basic insight. We have seen for years, I mean, the first time the data came out of DuPont, which showed that their thousands of disabled employees were regarded and assessed by their managers as just as effective, if not more, not a health and safety risk, all that stuff. Yep. That data has been floating around for 40, 50 years, and it doesn't work. Messages like they are more loyal don't work. I mean, I call that the golden retriever argument, right? Yep. Can you imagine? And I say, well, I hired a disabled person once and he wasn't loyal at all. Right? You can't generalize about 1.3 billion human beings. That's you wouldn't say, you know, people from the Indian subcontinent are more loyal and more compassionate. Yeah. We wouldn't dream of it. Or women are more compassionate. Yeah. Anyway, so we have to first start by saying the old messages haven't worked. And that's obvious. But also to say, actually, we are seeing change, and to pay attention to the messages that are capturing the attention of senior business leaders. So obviously, the work that Caroline Casey has done with Valuable 500, for the first time persuading 500 plus now major global companies to put disability on their board agenda. What do we need to do to up our game on disability? What is it that she has done that actually, with new messaging and a new approach, brought them to the table? Well, of course, she combines her personal experience. She's blind, that's just part of it, with a sense of justice. This is about addressing what she calls the disability equality crisis. Equality, not inclusion, right? Yeah. Because equality is, you can define it. These are what you have to do. This is what it looks like. Inclusion is a little too fudgy. Yeah. It's just vague. Fluffy. And she combines an understanding of business, the need to tailor your remarks and your comments to the audience you're addressing. So if she's talking to a group of bankers, she talks about access to financial services, not to drugs, unless she's talking to the pharmaceutical industry. You have to understand your audience, but you also have to understand that your job is to persuade the well-intentioned in that audience that there's mutual benefit here.
Yeah.
And, that you're not asking them for a charitable donation to a cause in the way that previous decades have approached business, because that is not economic empowerment. It doesn't bring people with disabilities into their citizenship rights.
Absolutely.
You're asking them to deliver the business improvements that also benefit disabled people, because it's business improvement to learn how to recruit everybody on the basis of what they can do if you were clever, rather than making assumptions. Black people can't work here and white people can't work there, whatever it might be. So the messaging is changing, and we need to help the disability sector work more closely with business so that they can understand what messages are most likely to resonate with which industries and so on. And the most important message of all, I think, is from the disability sector to a business leader: help me to understand your world. It's, if you were me, what would you do differently? Help me, give me advice, rather than do what I tell you and be more aware. And the sensitization training, well, of course, we all need to be more sensitive to things, but even the word sensitization training, I mean, do you wake up in the morning thinking, I want to be more sensitized and go to sensitization training? Implicit in that is you're not sensitive, right?
Yeah.
But if you're about to interview 20 potential interns who have disabilities, then training which equips you with the skills you need in order to do that interview well, in a way which actually accurately assesses that individual's capacity to do the job and your ability to adapt and so on, so that you can make it easier for them to succeed. Then absolutely connecting the awareness training and the skill development or capacity building training for business to the opportunity to engage meaningfully with people with disabilities. So it's not theoretical training. That makes lots of sense. I think I'm moving off the question, am I not, Anel? Where did you start me with this question?
I think we were talking about, the blaming the target audience.
All right.
So I think what the point that you were making about the collaboration model instead of the us versus them model. And
Yeah.
there's so much that each party can take from this collaboration if they were
Absolutely.
engaging in that way.
And I think, and it's understanding that the message to an employer is in the context of the conversation. And so the advocate assumes that the employer is saying to them, why should I hire disabled people? And I say to the employer, I'm not asking you to hire disabled people. I'm asking you to consider George or Georgina, who's got these skills and is hoping to work in your business because. And so it's that shift from trying to generalize about 1 billion people to focusing the employer on the fact that the ask is keep an open mind. How's that? That's just the ask. Keep an open mind and realize that there are things you don't know, which maybe if you knew, did you not know that there's some software out there now that lets, I don't know, people with dyslexia do this and that. And so I think it's that huge jump from generalizing about disabled people to saying, actually, what about those customers who want to purchase those goods online, but they're visually impaired? Those customers, not all disabled people, and giving them the data that relates to their business. I was talking to colleagues in Nairobi, and of course, the tourist industry is hugely important. Well, 1 in 3 people aged 50 to 64 have a disability, fact, anywhere in the world. And of course, people age 50 and above are the biggest spending tourists on the planet. So what do we do with that insight? Where does that take us? And so that's what I mean about tailoring the messaging, but starting with the assumption that actually we have to look at where the needs of business and the aspirations of people with disabilities coincide, because that's the crunch. So you need talent, you need productivity. That's where you need to improve your performance on workplace adjustments. You need brand reputation. Well, why do you never tell anybody that you're interested in hiring disabled graduates? Why are you not at the universities with a big sign up saying, visually impaired people who can't read this sign, come and see me? Sorry, that's where that sort of, but you know what I mean.
And I do think, Susan, the more we delve into the topic, one of the very strong themes coming through is just going back to the human level, the actual individual, not the homogenized group, and not making assumptions about the homogenized group, and just getting people to the table in a constructive way.
And I would add to that, don't make assumptions about business, right? Because that's why I keep going on about people in business. They're as diverse as you would ever meet. And I've had some senior business leaders who pride themselves on being tough and hard-nosed and nothing about the profit, who were the best advocates for people with disabilities internally, because they discovered that they were inefficient when it came to enhancing productivity. People were waiting 18 months for a new light bulb, being off sick with migraines, and he would go, that's just
How does that make sense?
That doesn't make any sense. We got to fix that. But he would never, ever have woke, he never woke up in the morning thinking my quest is disability rights. But he could see that actually if he created a system that gave everybody the tools they need, including that 20%, business actually benefited. But there was also a personal thing. I can remember him sitting at a table with, he was a COO, with other very senior players. And he said, so we've got it to the point now where people are waiting no more than 20 days, mostly, to get their adjustments. From 3 to 6 to 12 months it was. So he got it down to 20 days. And he said, but I've still got 92 colleagues with disabilities out there who hate my guts, was the way he put it, because they're still waiting. And he looked at these mainly men and he said, now you may think 92 people out of my 100,000 employees isn't very much, but when I'm standing in the lobby in the morning, I'm thinking that's 2 busloads of people coming into this lobby who are intensely unhappy with me. So there's also that personal pride in his professionalism that was struggling with all of that.
And Susan, you make such a good point about those adjustments and the productivity. You wouldn't have your entire workforce working on laptops that were so slow that they couldn't get anything done. You actually now saying to that person who needs an adjustment, you can wait 18 months. 18 months of your performance, productivity, success can be parked.
And of course, what it's often linked to is this compliance and distrust culture that says, first you have to prove you're disabled enough to trigger a legal obligation on me to give you the tools you need, or at least consider giving you the tools you need, because then I might decide it's not reasonable. Right? And so the message, of course, across the workforce is, I'm only going to treat you properly if I have to.
If I'm forced to.
And yet the C-suite isn't even looking at the impact of that kind of distrust on the workforce, so forcing people to prove they're disabled enough leads to the delays as they go to see doctors. The doctors who say, yes, this person is blind, then they have to go for an assessment to see if what the person said they needed, they really do need, according to an expert. That causes delays. Then they have to go out and order it, because procurement will not just let you order that one that you need. You have to get 3 bids in, and it takes months and months. In which time, of course, you've got a very increasingly unhappy individual blaming their manager, who's also unhappy because you still can't do your job. We hear stories of people going home for years because the chief technology officer couldn't figure out a way to get the tech to work for them, when actually, if they just brought in someone like Microlink, they could have fixed it overnight. However, the point is that this distrust and the delay then actually, ironically, for an outfit that only wants to comply with the law, means they're at risk in the law, because now you've got someone who's so angry and distressed and in such pain that they do lodge formal grievances. So now you've got all these people managing that grievance, wasting time, which costs money. And then maybe they do also go outside and start to litigate, depending on their jurisdiction. So for me, it's madness. And so I'm working now with colleagues in Mercer the consultancy firm, and with Microlink, who of course are a world's leading authority on how you do coordinate workplace adjustments to a best practice standard, to just try to draw the attention of the C-suite level executives that they're losing touch with what's going on. They don't know what's going on in their workforce. They don't know they've got 20 to 25%. And actually, the Boston Consulting Group are saying 25% of the workforce, as far as they can figure, have a disability. And that's looking out across thousands and thousands of people who've completed their survey around the world, not just, of course, BCG. So anyway, we're trying very hard to raise awareness of this issue simply by encouraging senior executives to start to ask the questions. What happens when people ask? What happens when someone develops a health condition and may technically not yet qualify as technically disabled according to law in Brazil? In Brazil, of course, having a migraine doesn't qualify as a disability. So does that mean you wouldn't change the light bulb because technically she's not disabled? You just sit there and watch her go home with her headaches? What?
And Susan, I think just from a human point of view, it's very difficult for human beings to ask for help. By the time I've asked for an adjustment, I've made myself vulnerable in that situation. I've reached out to you. I think the point of the erosion of trust, the erosion of your team culture, your organizational culture, when that person isn't supported, I think that is such an important point that you've just made. You mentioned that the C-suite sometimes is oblivious of how much red tape and wasted energy and wasted time there is built into these processes. Which brings me beautifully to my next question. Many business leaders are often unaware of what's happening within their own companies. And there's a lack of management information. The disconnect from your leaders and your workforce. Can you expand on that a little bit for me?
Well, I think we see it in so many areas. I was intrigued by the recent Deloitte research into wellness. Companies spending a lot of money now on wellness initiatives, from therapy to I joke, bowls of fruit in the lobby, whatever. But the point that really struck me was that they did a survey again across a whole range of industries and asked the same question of employees as they were asking of the C-suite. And one question in particular, is the physical health of your workforce improving over time? Now, have you seen a real improvement over the last 12 months? 80% of C-suite said yes. 36% of employees said yes. Now, Deloitte called that a disconnect. Yeah. But what really struck me was that Deloitte didn't draw the connection between the failure to give the employee who has a physical health condition issue the adjustment they needed, which might well have caused them to feel better at work, would alleviate the pain, would have made it easier for them to do their job. So the entire analysis about wellness overlooked the fact that it's people with health conditions and disabilities not getting the adjustments they need, which triggers absenteeism because of the pain and the adverse impact of their health condition on their performance at work. But the point here is, if 80% of the guys and guyettes at the top think things are better for their workforce and 36% of their workforce agree, that is a massive misunderstanding of what's going on. Somebody is really wrong.
And I mean, it's two completely different sets of realities.
And then when we look at what happens, when people with disabilities are working up the courage to take the risk to ask for an adjustment, because of course in many organizations they're fearful it'll impact their relationship with their colleagues. Their managers will think less of them. They won't have the same career opportunities. It's admitting to weakness and sickness and so on, as opposed to being entitled to a workplace adjustment. I think Kate Nash, the legendary founder of Purple Space, said to me once, when a woman is pregnant and goes to her boss, she feels entitled to maternity leave in many cultures. But that same woman who needs a 500-pound piece of kit because of her arthritis would really hesitate to ask, because there's no sense of entitlement. And yet the maternity leave is going to cost the company thousands. But most adjustments for individuals with disabilities cost in the hundreds. It's fascinating, right? So the managers not knowing what's going on is, for me, epitomized in, they'll say, well, we only have 2 or 3% of the workforce with a disability, so we don't have a problem. And then when the suggestion comes in that they might make it easier to get workplace adjustments, then the response is, well, we'll open the floodgates. So how can you combine the two? And they do. So deep down, I think there's a sense that they know there's probably a problem down there, but executives are failing to ask the questions that would tell them whether or not they have a fit for purpose response when people with disabilities, including an aging workforce, of course, out there, are requesting adjustments or need them, even if they haven't yet requested them. And those questions start with, how long does it take? Because if it's taking more than 20 days, routinely, more than a month, more than 3, more than 6, then we know there's a problem. And yet hardly any large organizations have a meaningful speed of response time. And we also know, of course, that they're not asking routinely every year, are you satisfied, managers and employees, with the way in which we respond when you need adjustments? And we know they haven't got the slightest idea what kind of adjustments are most frequently requested. And most importantly, of course, what kind of adjustments are denied. And we've got some exemplary companies out there like GSK, determined to operate a trust-based, best practice, managed process, so that they've actually got Andy Garrett managing the end-to-end thing that says he is responsible for making sure that on average it takes no more than 20 days to solve that person's issue. Very few companies have got a manager. They have an ad hoc response, an ad hoc-y thing. The government of Canada's public research showed 7 different routes in to try to get an adjustment. Managers couldn't figure out where to go, how to make the request, who was going to pay, how it was going to work. So yeah, managers are out of touch. And we're just hoping that actually, with the increased interest in productivity and with trying to get consistent performance from country to country, they'll start to see that giving everyone the tools they need and the flexibility and the open-mindedness in every jurisdiction in which they operate is going to ring a bell that says, maybe we need to manage that. And you can't manage stuff without having some qualitative insights into what's really going on. And so that first question is, what happens when?
And I do think, Susan, you put something into perspective. They see it as a cost, but it's actually an investment. And that's a mindset shift that needs to sort of find its roots in business when it comes to adjustments. If you think about during COVID, how quickly they could adjust to work from home, how quickly those arrangements were made.
Magic.
So I think it is possible. It's possible. But I think
I want to come in there on that point about cost, because what we've got now is the cost of distrust and compliance thinking are hidden. Those costs are hidden. Management has no idea how many days off, what is the loss, that costs money every time she takes 20 days as opposed to 1 day off because of those migraines. They have no idea what the costs are of managing these formal grievances, the costs of the lost productivity. But when you start to manage a process, the costs of managing it become visible. So suddenly you're asking people who manage to lose it and ignore it because of the poor practice. When they get into good practice, then it becomes visible. And I don't know how many companies I've seen who, once they saw the visible cost of giving people what they needed to do their job quickly, stopped it. They were more content with just leaving it kind of under the cover, cost of not doing it.
And I think also, you talked about the erosion of trust, loss of morale, loss of productivity. those costs are not easily quantifiable, but they do actually hurt the bottom line. So Susan, you often say, how hard is it to ask, what about disability? And I feel I would be remiss if I didn't bring this up in the podcast today. So how do we change that thinking, and how do we actually get the stakeholders that matter to start asking that question?
Well, and I guess I need to focus that question on the artificial intelligence and ethics and responsibility debate, right? Because that's when I first started to think we've got some of the most clever, gifted, rich people in the world gathering around tables talking about the impact of artificial intelligence for good and for bad around the world. Why do they never talk about people with disabilities or the disability experience or the disability dimension to being human? I'm fascinated. I think I'm sorry Jung is no longer with us, because I'm sure Jung would have had something to say about this. Maybe it comes back to my police sergeant feeling unprofessional. Is it that if you're head of ethical AI for one of the world's biggest companies, you don't want to admit you don't know much about disability? You don't actually think it's a medical thing. Doctors do that stuff. It's not a business thing. It's not an ethics thing, right? Maybe it's just as simple as they don't know. I mean, I was looking recently at, influencers have and researchers have investigated the impact of artificial intelligence when deployed by the American judicial system, by the police.
Yeah.
How certain populations, certain ethnic minorities are more likely to be denied bail, more likely to get longer sentences in jail because they're more likely to reoffend. But more than 40% of the prison population in America has a disability. 40%. Now, actually, I think that's a bit of an underestimate looking around the world. But why, in a world that's obsessed with data to the point where I get cross going, we don't need database decision-making, we need wisdom decision-making, backed up by some data, yeah? How could they ignore 40% of the prison population having a disability? Because it's the reason you didn't get through an algorithm assessment that says you're likely to reoffend is because they're looking at literacy and you have dyslexia. It's got nothing to do with whatever the algorithm thinks connects illiteracy to reoffending. So it's a mystery. However, we are certainly starting to see this is changing a bit. In fact, I'm addressing the National AI Advisory Committee to the White House again this evening, because they are starting to look at what are the implications for regulators, taking into account the potential threats to people with disabilities posed by artificial intelligence, certainly not just in HR. I mean, we are talking about access to every aspect of human life that's going to be impacted by AI, which seems to be every aspect of human life.
Yes.
So, and we do have a group with Disability Ethical AI, the website, coming together, trying to make this a center point for pulling the resources together that are hugely influential AI experts can turn to when somebody says 40% of the prison population has a disability and they go, oh gosh, I didn't know that. Where do I go for more? And very pleased that the Zero Project has been given a grant by the Seneca Foundation. They will, for the next year, be looking at big conferences, hugely influential conflabs, bringing people together at world level to look at artificial intelligence and issues around ethics, to bring speakers with disabilities and expertise, to get them on those platforms, to get them on stage.
Yeah.
And it's going to be very interesting to see what kind of resistors we encounter. Will a conference that's charging $4,000 just to walk into CogX, will they welcome a contribution from someone talking about the impact of artificial intelligence on the life chances of the 1 in 4 Americans who have disabilities? We're going to find out. But Zero Project is now bringing that together, looking for experts who have lived experience of disability, really understand this artificial intelligence and ethics debate to start to contribute. So that's encouraging.
Exciting.
And Goldsmiths College have just come on board. It's just the irony for me is that disability is so not on the agenda for the artificial intelligence debate that we haven't been able to get any money for a campaign to get it on the agenda. And so it's all a bunch of volunteers
Chicken
coming.
and egg.
Even the website, volunteer, fabulous contribution to the work. But so it feels very piecemeal. But I think the "and what about disability" message is particularly important in the context of the wider diversity and inclusion debate, because of course, diversity and inclusion is defined usually as race, gender, age, nationality. Sometimes they tag disability on at the end. I think the Valuable 500 work showed 4% have disability actually, in their frame. But then, of course, diversity managers have very little influence or budget to influence the chief technology officer, the chief procurement officer, chief property, the people, new product development, the guys responsible for the quality of customer care. So the "what about disability" question then is into procurement and is into property. And so it gives us a chance to go very directly in on the back of saying a business can't deliver the necessary improvements unless it's across the whole business. HR cannot deliver best practice on its own, far from it. They're just a small piece of the puzzle, an important piece of the puzzle. Their policies have to open up. They have to understand disability discrimination. They do need to be trained differently, but they're not the change agent. I think we're looking now for the C-suite to recognize they've got a gap. Talking about the need for a chief productivity officer, someone whose job it is to enhance productivity across the entire workforce, which means that person, as the chief productivity officer, has the conversations with the CTO and procurement and property and facilities management and HR to get an end-to-end process that delivers the flexibility and the tools everybody needs. So very encouraging to see Diageo has appointed a chief productivity officer.
Amazing.
So we're opening a conversation with Diageo. I want to interview that woman. I don't know. I haven't checked yet.
But I think, Susan, what you said absolutely gave me goosebumps. Framing it as something that's good for business, giving them an accountable head of productivity. And there it becomes about treating everyone equally, but individually to boost their personal productivity. I think that's a very powerful concept. Susan, so drawing towards the end of our podcast, I wanted to check in with you. What exciting plans have you got going on in the next couple of months? If our listeners are listening, where can they catch up with you in person? I know that you've got a lot of exciting projects on the go.
Well, catching up with me in person, you'd have to go to New Zealand. I'm really pleased. I've been invited by the New Zealand Employers Business Disability Network to be part of their conference and spending a week or so there meeting with their key stakeholders. Wow. Then off to Shanghai. And so Hai Bin Zhu, who runs that amazing China chapter of the Global Business Disability Network, is bringing some companies together in Shanghai. So if you're in Shanghai, listeners, please pop by. I'm going to be there 10 days, not all of it on work, I promise you. I suppose top of my list at the moment is the Global Disability ERG Disabled Employee Network Summit. So Global ERG Summit for short, October 15, working with Purple Space, bringing their program together and looking at how we're going to have hubs around the world where HSBC and other companies are going to bring ERG leaders together around a table in their office in, I don't know, Dubai or Sydney or Montreal, to talk about how we're now going to amplify what is a growing global movement, bringing ERG leaders together to learn from and with each other across geographies and across industry sectors. Very exciting work. Looking with Jürgen Menza and the Global Business Disability Network at promoting the self-assessment tool that I was able to put together with them last year, and encouraging procurement in partnership with the G3ICT, the UN-based body promoting, encouraging governments to meet their obligations under the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. We're looking at encouraging procurement to send the self-assessment tool, which is the global benchmark valid in any jurisdiction, that quickly gives a senior leader a sense of where they are against that definition of best practice, to send it out to their suppliers in Indonesia and developing countries, because otherwise, well, they're just not going to see it. They're not going to look at websites in Geneva and go, oh, that looks interesting. So that's really important. And I think I suppose the next best thing is to continue to look with the planners of the Global Disability Summit at how we engage business on a conference that is actually targeting more the disability rights movement and the governments that have signed up to the CRPD, but helping them to understand that if you position business as potential allies, then you amplify the impact of everything that you're doing in your communities. And just continuing to work with various national business disability networks and so on. I think I've forgotten something. What have I forgotten? Oh, the Zero Project. I think this bringing business leaders together in March in Vienna around the Zero Project is also another opportunity. So I don't know, I'm just kind of making it up as I go here.
That sounds super exciting, Susan. It sounds like a jam-packed next couple of months lying ahead for you, but all very, very exciting. So just to come to the final thought, sort of tying up this podcast in a beautiful bow at the end. If I gave you the opportunity to just leave our listeners and our viewers with a final thought on how we move forward in a very complex world with new challenges, new technologies, what would that be?
Oh, I knew you were going to ask that question. I think at a basic level, this message that the disability sector has tried to convey for so long, don't make assumptions about the potential of people with disabilities. I think this don't make assumptions message is hugely important. Don't make assumptions if you're in business that you understand what's going on with your workforce. Don't make assumptions that you know anything about the potential of people with disabilities you've never met. Certainly don't make assumptions about your HR team and the way they're using AI technology. So it's that big message. On the disability front, don't make assumptions about business. Right? Just don't think you're talking about a business. You're talking about human beings in the business and the structures and constraints that surround them. Don't make assumptions about who's the problem. So, and don't make assumptions, funders, that funding little projects for segregated programs that help disabled people for 3 years get a few jobs in this job market. So that's the answer. Do look for how together all these stakeholders come together to change the way job markets work. Because at the moment, the employers who want to get this right can't find suitably qualified people with disabilities without undue effort, right? Well, that's an inefficient job market. Job markets are supposed to make it easy for the supply and the demand to match up, right?
Yeah, the talent pipeline.
And disabled people can't find the employers that are willing to keep an open mind and bring them in. That's a job market problem. Yeah. So please, if you're a funder listening to this, don't fund projects. Fund the partnerships that transform job markets, and insist that any organization you fund, whether it's a training provider, mainstream or disability specific, or a disability organization, that they give you evidence that they value local employers as customers, service users, potential partners, potential allies, and that they can prove they are meeting the needs of business so that they're also meeting the needs of people with disabilities. I think I cheated and I didn't really answer your question, did I?
Well, I must tell you, that was a very good answer, I think, to tie it all up. But I just wanted to say my takeaways from this is more conversations, less assumptions. Treat people with respect, treat them as individuals, not as a homogenous group. So I got a lot from this conversation. And Susan, it was such a privilege to chat to you and interview you for your podcast.
Well, thank
you
you
so much for your time, and I can't wait for our listeners to engage with this content.
Super. Thank you very much. If you found this content relevant and perhaps even thought-provoking, please feel free to share with your networks.